Hey friends, welcome to the CNC Auto channel. I'm your friendly neighborhood mechanic, and today we got a 2008 Ford Edge in the shop. This thing won't start, so let's find out why. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through a process to teach you how to diagnose a no-start problem with just about any vehicle. By the end of this video, you'll be able to determine if it's the battery, the starter, the wiring, or some other cause for the no-start symptom. So come along and join me as we go through the process of figuring out why this one won't start. I guess the first place to start is to show you what it's doing. So let me go try and start it, and you tell me what you think it sounds like. Well, what do you think? Sounds to me like it has a weak battery. So why don't we test that? What can we do to see if the battery just needs more charge? I know, we'll put a jump box on it. So let's do that and see what happens. If you don't have one of these things already, you really need to get one. These little jumper boxes, they have come down quite a bit in the price lately, but man, I tell you, they're handy as all get out. You don't need jumper cables anymore. You got one of these things, hook it up to your battery, and you can start just about any vehicle. They sell them in all kinds of different sizes, and this one, believe it or not, is big enough, they say, to start a big diesel truck. So let's hook up our jumper box to the battery here. That way we have a full charge at least, and we'll try and start it again and see what it sounds like. Got 100% charge on our jumper box here. It's ready to go. Okay, so now we know that it's not the battery because we basically have a full charge battery now. What else could it be? So it won't start. As we turn it over, we hear this laboring instead of the normal. So we know that it's slowly turning the engine over. We have to think about why that might be. The things that come to mind are, how does a car of any kind, not just this Ford Edge, how does a car start? Well, we turn the key, that turns the ignition on, and that should send a signal to the starter to make the starter start turning over the engine. So when we turn the key, yes, it sends a signal to our starter, and the starter starts going, trying to turn the engine over. So we know that that part of the system is working. So what else in the system might be failing here? Well, that starter has to get its power, and it's a direct feed from the battery. So we need to look at that cable coming from the battery down to the starter and make sure that that is in good shape, able to carry that current needed in order to turn that motor. So let's go look at that. Here's the positive battery cable. We've got it disconnected right now, but it was connected very well. We wanted to make sure that that connection is good, nice and tight. You want to wiggle this thing and make sure that it's not turning on the post. That way you know it's getting good conductivity from the post into the cable. The other thing you want to do is check that cable itself. You want to make sure that here, where the cable especially is exposed, it's not all green and crusty. This one's in good shape, nice still copper. I mean, it's got a little bit of oxidation, but nothing bad. So make sure you check that cable very well. Follow it down the loom and all the way down to the starter, and make sure that you don't see any green crusties growing on it. So we've ruled out the ignition. It was sending the signal like it should to the starter, turning that starter on. We've ruled out the cable coming from the battery to the starter. That's in good shape, connected well to the battery, able to carry a current to that starter. Now, the only things left are the starter or the engine itself. The engine could be bound up inside and so very hard to turn over. The starter might be failing and laboring to turn over. So those are the two things we can check next. Let's see if the engine's easy to turn over by hand. Okay, so what we're going to do is I've taken off this passenger wheel. Now I'm going to remove this inner fender liner so that I can get behind here to the crankshaft pulley and the bolt on the front of the crankshaft. Now that I've got the fender liner out of the way, you can see the crank bolt here and the crank pulley. We're going to put a socket on this crank bolt and we're going to turn it in the clockwise direction, the tightening direction. You don't want to turn it in the counterclockwise direction or it might come loose. And if it's able to be turned by hand like this, it is, you know that the engine's not seized up, and that's not the reason for such a labored starting. Oh yeah, nice, smooth, except for where you get compression in each cylinder, it's turning very nicely. So that's not the reason. The internals are not the reason why this engine is having trouble starting. On to the next step. So we tested the engine. We tried to turn it over by hand, and it was turning over just the way it should, nice and easy by hand. So the only thing left is the starter. So let's go look at that starter real close. Do me a favor right now, hit that subscribe button. It's not going to sign you up for a bunch of junk mail or anything like that. What it does is it helps YouTube know that you guys are appreciating this content, and it helps me to reach a greater audience. I appreciate it. We've checked the reasons for it not starting, which were maybe a dead battery. It's not that. Maybe in some weird way the engine seized up. It wasn't that. So now let's look at the starter. And one of the things that you can't tell on there right now, that I can tell, is there's an odor coming from this engine bay, and it's kind of a pungent burnt smell. It's hard to describe. It's not like burnt oil, but it's kind of a burnt smell. And I wonder if that's going to come into play here as we look into this starting issue. The starter on this Ford V6, these Duratec 3.5, 3.7, is located here. And I wanted to see if we can maybe show you back under here. You see there's a, let me put this light here. All right, so here's a couple of coolant hoses here where my fingers are, and you can, if you can tell right down there where I'm pointing that one finger, you see that black gooey looking, tarry looking stuff? That's actually coming out of the back of the starter. That's where the starter lives, way down in there underneath the air cleaner. So let's take some of this stuff off and see what that's looking like. So let's get this air box out of the way. That comes off pretty easy. Just lift it right up. All right, let's unplug our mass air meter. Just pinch and pull. There's a air hose here. We've got one on the back side. Pull off. This is a PCV hose. It's got a little clip on it. You just pull, get it out of the way. There we go. All right, there's a hose here we can pull out of the way. Now we've got a worm clamp on either side of this flexible hose. So those worm clamps are 8mm. So we'll loosen them up. Sure love that Milwaukee ratchet, I tell you. All right, those are loose. Pop the hose off. Get it up and out of the way. There we go. We'll just set that right there. That'll be easy. Now we can take this upper part off. There we go. Set it out of the way here. Pull the air cleaner out. Okay, now we can take this lower portion of the air box off. There's a little bolt here, another 8mm. Don't want to lose that bolt, so I'm going to put it over here in this magnetic tray. Then you just pull up, and it pops out of some rubber grommets that hold it down. These little feet stab into those rubber grommets down there and keep it in place. Okay, now we can see down where we need to go. I'm going to move your camera here so you can see a little better. Here's our starter right down here. So this is your solenoid, and there's the starter motor down there, and sure enough, there's a lot of that black tarry substance coming out of it. And if you smell that stuff, it smells like that burnt smell that I was talking about. So here's probably our culprit, is this starter. It was working, it was turning the engine over, but very labored, very slowly. So whatever that insulating tar stuff on the inside of that starter motor is starting to ooze its way out, I think has gummed up the works, and that starter is failing. It's not completely dead. It didn't just click or anything like that, but it's failing. So we need a new starter on this. Sure enough, when we looked at that starter, what did we see? All that black goo oozing out of it. Remember that smell? That pungent odor, a burning smell, but not quite like oil burning? We knew going down there looking at that starter, when we saw that ooey gooey black stuff coming out of it and we took a smell of it, that's where it came from. That is a dead giveaway that that starter is failing. So now we know if we replace the starter, we should be good to go. So let's do that. You see these cables, especially this one here, that's coming directly from the battery, and so you don't want to cause any shorts or anything. So let's go ahead and disconnect our battery so we don't have any safety issues. The post on the battery can be removed with a 10mm. Just loosen that up. It doesn't matter which one you get. I'm pulling off the positive one. You can pull off the negative one. It's just to take away that short problem or potential for a short problem. There's a little bit of corrosion here we'll want to clean up, and make sure that you tuck that cable away somewhere where it's not going to accidentally slide over and jump back onto the post. Now it's time to remove the cables off of this starter. So you've got two cables coming down here. You've got your solenoid cable there, and then you've got your power cable here. The one that down here, the smaller solenoid one, that's a 10mm, and then this one with the battery cable going to it is a 13mm. And if you've got some of these wrenches with the little dog leg in them, it comes in really handy for this job. Just let you get in there on top of those things and break them loose a lot easier than trying to get a socket or a regular wrench in there. Once you break them loose, for the most part, they'll probably be something you can twist off by hand. Yeah, no problem. Go ahead and break off that 13 now. Let's go ahead and get that 13 loose now. Go. See, here's one of those examples where the reason why we disconnected that battery, if I'm trying to loosen this positive cable coming down here and this wrench touches this little piece of metal right here, which is grounded, it'll spark and cause all kind of havoc. Might even short out your computer for worst case scenario. There's that one. Okay, set it aside. May need it, but likely the new starter will come with its own. Almost done getting that 10mm off of that starter solenoid. Just be careful not to drop these bolts. You're living right if they fall all the way to the ground, but oftentimes they get hung up somewhere in there. Does that ever happen to you? Leave me a comment down below. I'd love to hear about it. I think it happens to everybody. All right, now these come off. Get out of the way. Perfect. All right. So the wiring is free. Now the only thing left is there's a couple of bolts, and I'll rearrange you here so you can see. There's a couple of bolts that hold this starter to the engine. want to show you a little closer the bolts that hold that starter onto the engine. Kind of got a peek between these two coolant hoses. You can see down in there. Get that out of your way. There we go. All right. So this is the other end of that starter, and you got these two bolts that hold it in place. One of them right up here has this plastic wire retainer on it that we'll have to pry up and out of the way. Let me see if I can do that while you're watching. Get underneath this and pry it up and off of that bolt. There we go. Now you can see the bolt. And then there's the other bolt on the other side. Both of these bolts are 13 millimeter, and we'll get those out now. Now to get these things out of there, I'm going to use a really long extension with a 13 millimeter socket on the end. Now, especially when I'm trying to get down into an area where that socket might fall off and get stuck, I love to use these extensions that have these collets on them that allow you to put that socket in place, and that collet will lock it on. And so once it's in place, it doesn't want to come off. See? We'll snake this long extension in there and just break these 13 millimeter bolts loose. There it is. Boy, that is tight. Let's do the other one now. And once they're broke loose, you can use your electric ratchet if you desire, but the torque that these things are held on with, you do not want to try and use your ratchet to break that loose. You'll break your ratchet. There's that one. Go ahead and fish that out of there before we lose it. Got a little magnet here. There we go. Let's get the other one. You know, I was talking about this little collet. Well, I tried to squeeze it down in between these two hoses, and those hoses ended up pushing that collet up and released my socket, and it fell. But again, I must be living right because it fell all the way to the floor. Let's try this again. All right, I'm going to snake it down in there and get it on that second of the two bolts that hold the starter in place. There we go. Now she's loose. Get our little magnet to get that bolt out of there before it gets lost down somewhere inside the guts of the engine. There it is. Going fishing. Always a good feeling when you catch a fish. All right, now come along with me as we figure out if this starter can come out of here without having to remove either this linkage for this transmission shifting or the coolant hoses. I'm trying to avoid that because if I have to remove these coolant hoses, I'm going to have to drain the coolant first. So let's see what we can do. If I had this coolant hose out of the way, it would be easier. But I am trying to do this as easily as I can with removing as little as possible to help you guys who are trying to do this same thing. Okay, got it rotated all the way, sort of with its butt end sticking up. Let's see if we can figure out a way to snake it out of there now. I wonder if I put this thing into a different gear, if we couldn't maybe have a little bit more room. Let's try that. Okay, so I went in the truck and I shifted it into low gear, which is as far down as it would go. And all that's done is it's pivoted this shift arm that way, out of our way a little bit. I wonder if that's enough to get this starter out now without having to take off this coolant hose. Let us see. Are we going to be lucky? Do you feel lucky, punk? Well, do ya? Old Clint Eastwood line for you guys that are younger than most. Hey, look at that. We got her. Woohoo! Look at there, we got her. Woohoo! And we didn't have to take off the coolant hoses. All we had to do was shift our gear shifter into the lowest gear. And it gave us just enough room to sneak this out. All right. Yeah, this is a little bit tough to turn. Oh yeah. I'm thinking that whatever is going on inside of here, it's failing. Time to put the new one in. So here it is. The new starter has arrived. Here's the old starter that we removed. As you can see that the two look exactly the same. You want to make sure that the new part looks like the old part. The old part, as we noted before, was oozing its black goo out here. And boy, that stuff stinks real bad. New one looks to be in good shape. We will put this one in and see if that cures the problem. So we're going to put the starter in where it goes. Remember, the way to get more room under here without having to take off either your coolant hoses or any of this other peripheral stuff down here is to shift the transmission into low gear. What that does is it rotates this arm all the way back and gives you a little bit more space here to fit that new starter in and out. To give ourselves just a little bit more room right through here, I'm going to remove this shifter clip. In order to do that, use a small screwdriver, come in here and pry up on the locking mechanism just a little bit, and then you can push it back. You want to take note of how many lines or how far in this shifter block is located so that when you put it back in place, your shift linkage will move the same way. And once you get this thing about halfway off, it'll lock on again. So you'll come in here from this side with your screwdriver and then twist it a little bit like this. And that'll raise this lock up again so that it will slide off of the bushing retainer. Right there. There we go. Now you can take this and lift it right up and out of the way. That'll give us a little bit of room. So with this shift linkage out of the way, you would think that it would give us enough space to pass the new one in, but it really doesn't. So we're going to remove this shift arm right here. This is a 15 millimeter nut, and the shift arm wants to shift the transmission. If you put too much torque on this, it might actually shift from low gear into second into drive. So what you can do is use an impact on that just to break it loose. And once it's loose, you can take that nut off of there. So don't lose that. And this shift arm is going to be remain in its position because it has a little groove in the arm. See that oblong shape? And that fits only one way on here, so you don't have to worry about putting it right back in the right position. As long as this didn't shift out of gear when you took that nut loose, then you should be able to put this back on, put the nut back in place, hook up your linkage, and you're good to go. But now look at all that space that we've got to work with. So we've got a lot more space here now. We can put this back in. Get your wires out of the way so they don't get pinched. Make sure that none of them are getting underneath where the teeth are and where it engages with your flywheel. So once you've got it in the space here, you want to point the nose a little bit down, and you can look back there where it goes and meets up with the flywheel. Point that nose a little bit down and put it in place, and it'll fall right where you need it. And you'll see, if you can look down in here, let me move you around here, you'll be able to see down in there where that bolt hole lines up, so that you can start one of the bolts. Once you have it in place, you can start this bolt in by hand, and always want to start by hand so you don't cross thread it. Don't try to put it in with your electric ratchet or anything. And remember, the one that has the stud on it goes in the back here. The other cool thing about removing this shifter arm here is that you can get your hand back in here to start those bolts by hand and twist them in. Make sure that that starter is in the right location. There's no way that you would have been able to get your hand, your arm in this area with that shifter linkage in place. Once you've got the bolts started by hand and you're sure that they're going in straight, you can go ahead and shift over to your ratchet. I'm going to use electric ratchet here. This is a 13mm socket. Put her on there. Nice long extension. Just want to snug it up. You don't want to tighten it quite yet. You want to go and do each one a little bit at a time. Okay. Now we can snug it up. I'm going to switch over to a regular ratchet for that. That way you can tell how much torque you're putting on it. Tighten each one to torque spec, and then go back and double check. Now that the body of the starter is tight in place, we can go ahead and put our cables back on. I'll go ahead and do this top one just because it's in the way. Make sure your battery's still disconnected so you don't accidentally get any shorts or sparks. And the new starter comes with its own nuts and washers, so you don't have to worry about saving the ones off the old one. Put it in place, and there's a little dog leg here on the back side that fits over here on the side of the starter, keeps it from rotating as you tighten it up. There we go. Okay, we'll tighten that up here in a second, but let's go ahead and put the other cable on. It's real easy to lose these nuts and washers if you're not careful. So take your time with this. You can use a magnet on your finger or something like that if you're worried that you might drop it down in somewhere inside the engine. And this cable also has a little dog leg on it. Let me see if I can show it to you. That's going to hold it from rotating as you tighten it up. First, the flat washer, then your lock washer, which is the one with a split in it, and then your nut. It's funny how the smell of that old burned up starter is still present, even though that thing's long gone. Tighten these up by hand, and then we can go back with a wrench. And to tighten that up, we're going to use these dog leg wrenches again. Reach back in there and get that smaller of the two cables first. It's a 10mm. You just want to snug this thing up. You don't want to crank on it too hard, you might break the little stud off. Now we can go tighten this larger of the two. It's a 13 millimeter. Nice and tight. Good. So let's reinstall this shifter linkage. Remember, it's got that oblong shape there with the flat sides, and there's flat sides on the shifter itself. So we'll put this on here and we'll wiggle it into place. Just make sure it's kind of lined up. It may not seat all the way, but that's okay. That'll seat once we tighten up our retaining nut here. Start that by hand, of course. And this is a 15 mil. We're going to tighten it up with this impact. I'm going to hold that arm so it doesn't move. Couple of clicks, okay? You don't want to go monkeying with it and, you know, driving that sucker around. You might damage something inside that transmission. Next, we can reinstall our bushing retainer. The bushing stays on the arm, by the way. It kind of holds onto the little nub there. So we'll just orient that like so. Slide it in place. And then we take our locking clip, and it's open on this side, so it's going to slide over. Remember that we took it off the other way. It's going to slide over, and it's going to click in place as the little catch rides over this. So slide it on and just push it over. There's one click, and it'll click a second time as it gets into its final position. There it goes. Okay, and it didn't move on me, but if you're worried about it, remember you can count how many little markings are here. There were 6 of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. It's placed. So now we know that when we shift this thing, it's going to shift the way that it did before we started this work. We didn't have to drain the system of coolant. We didn't have to remove the coolant hose. We were able to get the old one out and put the new one in. And removing the old one would have been even easier if we had removed this shift bracket to begin with. Lesson learned there. You guys take that tip and run with it. So before we put everything back together that was in here covering up the area that we needed to work on, let's go ahead and see if this thing will start. And that'll tell us if the work that we did was necessary. First things first, let's reconnect our positive battery cable. Wiggle it, make sure it's good and tight. And let's see what'll happen. Now, before we can start the car, we need to put it back into park. So you can watch that shift arm move back into position. Now we can try and start it. All right, that's what we wanted to hear. So now that we know we got a good repair, we can go ahead and start replacing all of this peripheral equipment that we had to remove in order to get down here to that starter. So good job. First thing we want to reinstall is our air box. Remember, it stabs in with these little nubs down into these holes down here. And then this snorkel has to fit on this little area up front where it breathes from in front of the radiator. If you get the little nub stabbed in correctly, this bolt will line up with where it goes in as well. There we go. And you'll feel it kind of pop down a little bit whenever it's in place. You can start this bolt to retain it where it should be. We'll go ahead and tighten this bolt. It's a 8 millimeter. Replace our air filter. Snaps in there like so. And the airbox lid. It's got these little tabs that just slide in back here. and then the front comes down and is held on by a couple of clips. Just like that, easy as pie. Comes our air hose, air intake hose, and this end goes to the throttle body, this end to the air box, and then we'll have to reconnect this hose here and over here, this hard plastic line with the funny clip. In order to put that back on, just push it on, it'll snap in place. Don't forget to plug in your mass air meter. PCV hose. Now we can tighten the worm clamps, 8mm. Tighten the one on the throttle body and tighten the one at the air box. That way you don't have any unwanted air leaks. And finally, we can replace our airbox silencer. This just pushes into the top here. I find it easiest to line up the small one and then push that in place, and then the big one will fall right in the spot. There we go. So it's all about process. In this case, we did the process of elimination. Wouldn't start? Well, what controls whether our vehicle starts or not? Let's go down the list and knock those things off one at a time until we find the problem. This one came in with no check engine light, remember? So it's not like the computer was going to tell us what the problem was. We had to understand the system and go through that troubleshooting checklist. So hopefully you guys found this process really helpful, walking step by step through the system, trying to find the root cause of the issue. And I know that if you follow this process on just about any vehicle, you'll be able to quickly get to the root cause of the starting issue on your car. And if you haven't already, please hit that like and subscribe button. It really helps the channel out. And don't forget to check out our other videos like this one here, where, as always, you're going to get the most detailed information about how to repair your car. And also, I've done all the hard work for you. I'll go through and scour the internet for all the best tips and tricks to save you time and save you money. Y'all have a wonderful day, and God bless.